Hi, everyone. I'm Susan O'Donnell. I'm the lead investigator for the CEDAR Research Project at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. I am grateful to live and work in the Wolastoqiyik unceded and unsurrendered homeland. This land was never won by or legally signed away to the British Crown or later to the Government of Canada. I'm here with four of my colleagues on the CEDAR project. They will be discussing a new book, Nuclear is Not the Solution: The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change, which was published by Verso Books in July this year. The author is M.V. Ramana, who is professor and Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia. Ramana is joined today by three research assistants on the CEDAR project. All are students at St. Thomas University. Emma Fackenthall is pursuing a double major in English and Environment and Society. Erin Hurley is pursuing an honors degree in Environment, Society and a major in journalism. And Kate Haché is pursuing an honors degree in economics and a major in international relations. Erin, Emma, and Kate have each read a different chapter of Ramana's book and will engage him with questions they had from their readings. I've asked Ramana to keep his questions short, so there is time for as many questions as possible. I will just get right into it, and I will ask Kate to start with her first question. Thank you.
But I was wondering if there is any way that nuclear reactors can be cost effective. Like, does efficiency play into the role?
That's a great question. So the nuclear industry would tell you two things. One is they would say, um, you cannot compare a solar plant with a nuclear plant because the solar plant operates for maybe 20% of the time, whereas a nuclear reactor can operate up to 90% of the time. And so the high cost of the nuclear power plant is being compensated by the fact that it produces a lot more electricity and more consistently. The second argument they would make is that a solar plant or a wind turbine generate electricity only when the sun is shining, only when the wind is blowing, whereas a nuclear power plant is quote unquote base load source of power. Now, those arguments are they ought to be taken seriously, but I would sort of offer 2 points for people to think about. The first is the reliability of a plant, of any nuclear power plant or a wind turbine or a solar plant, does not really determine the reliability of the electricity grid. So the electricity grid is the way by which we all get our electricity. So when I switch on the light here, when I flip the light switch here, my bulb starts glowing, and the reason it starts glowing is somewhere along the way, some power plant increases its production infinitesimally so that there's a little bit more electricity in the system that is being used by my light here. And this is done reliably in the sense that we are usually confident that when we turn the switch on, the light will come on, right? How does the grid manage to do this? It manages to do this primarily by spreading out the production. There are many, many, many different power plants of all kinds, and they combine to provide reliable electricity. Reliability does not come from an individual reactor or an individual solar plant. It comes from the fact that we have this combination of multiple generators around the world. So it's what's called a system property. It's not an individual property, right? The property of a system, of a particular power plant. The second thing to note is that the idea of a base load source is something which we ought to forget about in today's world. The base load idea is a remnant of a past period when planners for electricity supply used to conceive of the supply requiring plants that operate for very, very long periods of time always, and then some plants that go peak periods, operate only during peak periods. Renewables fit into neither a base load or a peak definition. And as the amount of renewables in the system increases, we have to think about a different way of organizing system. And that's something which is a big question, which I'm not going to get into right now. But I think those are the reasons why the familiar arguments about, oh, nuclear plants are so much more efficient, don't really make a lot of sense.
Thank you.
So thank you everyone for being here. I read chapter 5, Nuclear Power for War. And my question, this is a question about nuclear energy and empowerment, and I'm kind of going off of Kate's question of reliability, especially since I've seen that diversified grids can be more reliable than just relying on nuclear alone. Do you believe that countries are interested in developing nuclear energy more so for the power of a bomb than for addressing climate change? For me, I think this would make a lot more sense because why is there such a push for this technology when we have renewables that are tried and true?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of correlation. Okay, if you look at nuclear plants around the world, the majority of them are in countries that have nuclear weapons. The United States, Russia, China, France, the UK, India, Pakistan, all of these countries have nuclear plants and they also have nuclear reactors. In some cases, the nuclear bombs came first, and in some cases, the nuclear power plants came first. Historically, too, the first nuclear reactors anywhere in the world were built to produce plutonium to use in nuclear weapons. The first bomb that was tested in New Mexico in July 1945, and the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, both used plutonium from reactors at the Hanford site in Washington State in the United States. So there's that. Now, there are also other connections having to do with the basic technology that, once you have nuclear power plants, you already have some of the materials that you need to produce material for nuclear weapons. You have trained personnel, and often the institutions that operate or promote nuclear power are also the ones that are in charge of nuclear weapons materials. So in the United States, that's the Department of Energy. In India, that's the Department of Atomic Energy. So there are a lot of overlaps here. And we also see historically countries that seek to make nuclear weapons or seem to be interested in making nuclear weapons, first starting by saying, we're going to develop nuclear power for peaceful purposes, for generating electricity and so on. So there's a lot of evidence that suggests that, in many cases, countries that claim they are building nuclear plants for providing electricity for their people to address climate change and so on, might actually be interested in developing the capacity to make nuclear weapons as well.
And so that can change at any time. They can say we're starting just with civilian energy sources, but then anytime they can change and make bombs.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. So a nuclear power plant gives you the capacity. You may not have the intention. You may be very genuine in saying, I'm not interested in making bombs right now. But 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, the government changes. There's a new set of leaders. They have completely different ideas and they have the capacity. So once a country acquires nuclear capacity of one kind or the other, that capacity is available to all leaders, regardless of what their intention is. And that's not something which we can envision right now.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your detailed answers so far. So my next question is similar to my previous question. It's focused on the language used to describe SMR technology. by proponents of it. So I've also seen it described as clean or green on like Moltex and ARC websites, for example. But similarly, I haven't seen much elaboration on these claims, besides the fact that these plants would emit low amounts of carbon. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on this, and whether you think low carbon emissions should be the only requirement for something to be considered a green energy.
Yeah, that's clearly the answer is no in my opinion, and that's because carbon dioxide is not the only pollutant in the world, right? It's not the only environmental problem. It's not the only metric that we should be using. Yes, a nuclear power plant produces little or no carbon at the point of generation. There is some amount of carbon emissions that are associated with the chain of processes that you require to build and operate a nuclear power plant, but those are small in comparison with fossil fuels. But any nuclear plant will necessarily produce radioactive waste. That's an inherent part of the process. And there is no demonstrated solution to dealing with these radioactive waste. And if you're going to be, and these are going to be hazardous for hundreds of thousands of years. So you are going to be passing on an environmental and a health burden, public health burden to future generations, right? So there is an environmental impact of that kind. And secondly, you also have to ask whether the pursuit of nuclear power enables the maintenance of current fossil fuel infrastructure, precisely because a nuclear plant takes much longer to construct, right? And it's much more expensive. So you're going to get far less carbon benefits by building nuclear power plants as opposed to, let's say, renewables. So there are, even in terms of carbon, a nuclear power plant cannot be considered to be as clean or as efficient in reducing carbon pollution as compared to renewables.
Thank you. And yeah, something that I've always been confused by is you mentioned that these take much longer to build, and I've often seen them marketed as a way to mitigate climate change, but I've seen that the SMRs aren't predicted to be operational until 2030, which is when like the first national climate change target is for Canada. So do you agree with the argument that these SMRs are actually just a form of climate delay rather than a climate solution?
I do think they are a form of climate delay. I don't think the 2030 timeline is actually realistic. And that's partly because, again, looking at the historical record, SMRs have always been promised at much earlier stages than actually happen. So, for example, the leading design in the United States is the so-called NuScale design. That's at least one version of their design has been licensed for construction, modulo certain conditions by the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And when NuScale was set up in the first decade of the century, they were promising that the first NuScale nuclear plant would start supplying electricity by 2015, 2016. That deadline kept moving. Now they talk about 2029, but the first nuclear SMR project, the NuScale project, was canceled in November of 2023. Was it November 2023 or November 2022? Whatever, I forget the date. Anyway, about a little over a year or so ago. And the main reason was that the cost was so high, right? And so now there is no plan to build a NuScale plant. And so there's no even a realistic timeline for when this can happen. And the same is true with the SMRs that have been proposed for New Brunswick too, right? ARC 100 was supposedly the design that was more advanced, but we see that they fired their CEO left. They have fired a bunch of people. They seem to want a lot more money that the government can give them. And so it's not very clear that they will actually have an operating design that's ready to be constructed anytime soon.
Thank you.
My next question is about the importance of public appearance to the nuclear industry. So you began chapter 3 by discussing the story of CE&G executive Kevin Marsh, who, as you pointed out, was interested in both helping the less fortunate and also committing fraud. So we see a similar trend in helping people with nuclear in Canada as well, like Moltex and ARC, who have sponsored many nonprofit organizations. And I wanted to ask you to develop on this point. Mainly, do you think there is a trend for nuclear companies to show a genuine side? And if so, why?
Yeah, so I think I won't talk about genuineness because we really don't know what's going on in their minds. They, for all like purposes, they may be genuine, but we can only see that there's a standard operating pattern. If you think about society at large, today, most things in this world are controlled by large hierarchical, powerful corporations who all learn from each other about how to uh, find ways of sucking in public money, privatizing all the profits and socializing all the costs. And one way to do that is to pretend to really care about public things. So you see, it's not just the nuclear companies, it's also, let's say, members of the military industrial complex. They will all be funding local Boy Scout groups or the local public library, and they will show up at the various community fairs and, pretend to be a very good member of the community and so on and so forth. And these are all ways by which they seek to get public support. And they need public support precisely for what I mentioned, which is that they have to find ways of getting the public to pay for whatever they are producing, even though these things might be expensive, might be unnecessary for the public. And so that's, I think, part of the standard operating procedure for these kind of companies.
And to relate it back to what you and Erin were discussing earlier, do you think this public appearance movement is related to potential risks that are associated with nuclear, like meltdowns and minor accidents?
Yes, it is related. I think it's related to two things. One is there is opposition to nuclear facilities when they are first proposed. And we see this around the world. Whenever a new nuclear site is proposed, there often is going to be opposition. And that's linked in part to the risk of accidents. And that's a legitimate concern for people because the most impacted from severe accidents like Fukushima and Chernobyl, or even smaller accidents, tend to be the local people, right? If there are leaks of, let's say, tritium from a reactor, then that'll contaminate the groundwater, which is going to be used locally, right? So they obviously have to be more concerned about it than other people. But once a nuclear plant or any other facility is built, it changes the local political economy. There are going to be groups of people who are working in those plants, and so they don't want to see it closed because that means they're going to lose their jobs. The local townships get a certain amount of tax revenue and other kinds of financial support, and so they tend to support it. There are local businesses that become involved, and so the pattern changes of opposition and support. And so that's something which I think all of these companies like to play on. But as I said, I think it's opposition, but it's also the larger question of how they continually require public money of subsidies and things of that sort. And that requires them to try to maintain a good public persona.
Thank you.
So my question is about public perception of nuclear technologies. And in your view, what are the main misconceptions the public has about the relationship between nuclear energy and weapons?
That's a great question. Actually, I don't have a very good answer for that. because I don't think there have been any good polls on what people see as a relationship to them, right? What we do see is a lot of public messaging from the nuclear industry and other nuclear advocates to say that nuclear power and nuclear weapons are not related. There have been consistent efforts by the nuclear industry dating back to the 1953 Atoms for Peace speech by US President Eisenhower, who was trying to change the public image of nuclear power from one that was related. I mean, nuclear technology is being primarily related to the bomb and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to one that says, oh, we are trying to use nuclear technology for the good of the world, whereas the evil Soviet empire is using it for bad things. All right. And the Soviets, of course, had exactly the opposite, or actually the parallel messaging, saying our atoms are good. It is atoms for workers. Atoms are the workers. They are not soldiers. All right. In the Soviet version of it. And so this was the public messaging, and that is continued till now, right? And there's some evidence that some people oppose nuclear power because of this connection. And that's exactly what the nuclear industry tries to break. However, I'll point out that there are exceptions to this trend of trying to separate out. And those happen whenever the nuclear industry feels a particular requirement or a particular need to get public subsidies, government subsidies. So at that time, the nuclear industry plays up the connection between nuclear power and military technologies in general. So in the US, they'll talk about how so many people who work in the nuclear submarines and nuclear navy go on to working in nuclear power plants. And that's why we need to have a lot of continued nuclear power plants. And we need to train students to learn nuclear engineering so that they can come and work both in the nuclear navy and in nuclear power plants. And in the UK, same kind of story about the relationship between the Trident submarine and continued subsidies for nuclear power. So that's the one time when the narrative changes significantly, though that particular narrative is not usually directed at the public, but at members of elite organizations and the government.
Thank you.
So my next question is about the very real concern, which you discussed in chapter 1 of more frequent severe weather patterns due to climate change and the effect that these could have on nuclear plants. And I found this to be a very valid point to your argument about the impossibility to characterize nuclear energy as safe. And I wonder if you've seen this being addressed at all in the current conversations around SMRs, such as by those in Moltex, ARC, or the Canadian government.
Yeah, it's a bit of an irony that nuclear power, which is billed as a solution to climate change, actually faces greater threats because of severe weather events. And this has to do with the fact that the reason why nuclear plants are at increased risk in the case of severe weather events is that nuclear power plants always need to be cooled. Even if a nuclear reactor has been shut down and is not supplying any electricity, the radioactive fuel inside the core of the nuclear reactor continues to be emitting heat because of radioactive decays, and that heat has to be taken out of the nuclear reactor. So if you think back to the Fukushima accident, the accident at the Fukushima Daiichi plant in 2011, the reason those reactors melted down was not because they were operating. By the time the tsunami came on March 11th, the reactors had already been shut down, but the fuel was still hot, and the tsunami basically stopped all possible ways of trying to take the heat out. That's the concern with climate change events as well, right? So in the case of a severe storm or for example, if there's a big forest fire, a fire that sort of engulfs near the plant, you might lose all possible ways of cooling the plant. The other concern is that in the event of an accident, all nuclear plants typically have certain plans for emergency measures for how to evacuate people around there and so on and so forth. Those could also be challenged in the case of severe weather events. And lastly, we can also imagine challenges to the continued operation of, to continued presence of operating personnel, right? If people cannot get to the plants and replenish, people have to go home after some point and go to sleep and stuff like that. If that cycle is being interrupted by the fact that you have a severe storm or something of that sort, then that's also a challenge to the continued safe operations of the plant.
Thank you. I was also wondering, so far all of my questions have revolved around these safety claims and the language that nuclear proponents are using to describe nuclear plants as safe. And in your chapter, you discuss something called safety by rhetoric, which is the disconnect between the past reality of meltdowns of nuclear plants and the future claims of safety. And so I was wondering how you think everyday citizens can increase their awareness about nuclear reactors and their history of meltdowns and other detrimental effects on the environment and health of people, et cetera, in order to combat this safety by rhetoric.
Well, the simplest answer is, read my book. No, I'm joking. It's sort of the I think at some level, members of the public know that reactors are unsafe, and everything. I mean, accidents are a fact of life. That most people realize that, right? You can tell them that a car is safe, but all people will say, well, cars can have accidents, right? The difference between nuclear power plants and cars or airplanes is that most people don't encounter them on a regular basis. And these accidents are far less frequent than cars or airplanes. That you have to admit, because these are once in a decade type events that are happening. But when that happens, it's far more severe. Much larger areas are contaminated, a lot more people are affected, and the effects last much longer. So there are still areas around the Chernobyl plant, which had an explosion in 1986, that still cannot be inhabited because of the high levels of radiation, right? So that's a suggestion of how long these things can happen. Knowing all of these facts are what should lead people to be sort of more skeptical of the results of nuclear of the risks of nuclear power. But the media, unfortunately, has a fairly short attention span. I mean, there's always new things that are happening. They want to be covering that. And so it's hard for members of the public to be aware of this. And I mean, there's no easy answer, right? We have to do what we do, write about it, talk about it, and things of that sort. I hate to use the word educate, even though I'm in an educational institution, because it sort of suggests that I have all the knowledge and somebody doesn't. But it's sharing of knowledge, shall we say, knowledge exchange, that we can help deal with this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm just keeping an eye on time, and this question is the one that kept with me while I was reading through the chapter, so I want to make sure that I'm able to ask it. And it's about government funding for nuclear reactor development. So if these companies keep failing, keep increasing the bills of ratepayers and taxpayers, are being brought up on corruption charges like CEDAR or SNC-Lavalin in Canada, and also considering all the harmful risks we've been mentioning, what continues to make nuclear so attractive for governments and for people?
Yeah, that's a great question. At one level, I really cannot give an answer for that because I have to be inhabiting the brains of people who are in government, and I don't know that. But at a different level, you can sort of look at correlations. So the most extreme example of that are some of the countries and some of the provinces that are most invested in fossil fuels are also the ones who talk very loudly about nuclear power. So in the case of Canada, we see that, for example, in the case of Alberta. Okay. Alberta is strongly committed, the government of Alberta, that is, strongly committed to maintaining its role in fossil fuel production, especially the oil sands. But you also see them constantly talking about the use of, oh, we want to have small modular reactors and nuclear plants. Now they're even talking about a large nuclear plant using CANDU reactors. And what is interesting there is to see what they want to use that nuclear power for. So one of the purposes that they talk about is to produce the heat that is used to produce the oil sands, to extract the oil out of the oil sands. Now, in doing that, what they are doing is two things. One is assuring or trying to ensure the continued production of fossil fuels to make it seem greener and more acceptable to members of the public because of the concern about climate change. And the irony there is that the greatest impact of the production of oil and gas from these sources happens when the oil and gas is burnt. It's not at the production site that most of the emissions occur. So trying to address the emissions at the point of production is a drop in the bucket compared to all of the emissions that happen when the oil or the gas is burnt. Okay, so it's kind of going at the wrong end of it in the first place. But the second is you also know that this is going to take a long time, right? So as long as this is these reactors are not deployed, you're going to continue to produce all those emissions as well. So anyway, why am I bringing that up? Because I think the primary concern of many of these governments is to maintaining the status quo, right? Climate change is a very dire threat to our societies. It asks us to rethink fundamental social and political realities and how we produce energy and materials in this world. We need to be rethinking all of that. We need to be restructuring societies. We need to think about whether continued economic growth can happen forever. But these are all very uncomfortable questions for governments. They don't want you to think about it. So they want you to pretend that, oh, there's this technology that's going to come in and save us so that we don't have to do any of these changes, right? And I think nuclear is part of that menu of choices that they want to pretend. So, you see many of these governments who also saying, it's not just nuclear power. We also invest in carbon capture and storage. We will also do hydrogen. And they'll do some renewables as well, all of those kinds of things. But they don't want to have any larger structural changes. And I think that's part of the more uncomfortable conversation, right? It's the really inconvenient truth of climate change.
I also wanted to connect this to another question I had in hopes that we could provide sort of a Canadian context for this. And so this is about Westinghouse in specific. So in your chapter, you talk about how Westinghouse has had like a multitude of issues with previous projects. But as we saw in 2022, Canada awarded Westinghouse a $27 million grant for their eVinci microreactor. So I was wondering if you can comment on like why Westinghouse still receives support even with all of the issues it has had in its history.
This is, I think, related also to Erin's question of, safety by rhetoric. The way that the nuclear industry continues to get government support, and this also goes back to your previous question, is by pretending that history never happened. All right. We can just move on. All those things that happened, they were things of the past. We now have a new generation of new reactor designs, small modular reactors, micro reactors, advanced reactors, generation 4 reactors. The names are sort of, don't mean really very much, right? But that's the sell for the nuclear industry. They keep saying we have these new things. whatever happened in the past, happened in the past. Don't talk about it. Let's think to the future. We do need nuclear power, and you need to subsidize us, right? Right. That's, I think, the pitch that they have. And which companies win these large grants, which don't? That's, I think, a matter of sort of, small p politics inside these bureaucracies, right? Who has more lobbying power? Who's seen as more effective? Who are the what are the geopolitical underpinnings of picking Westinghouse as opposed to, let's say, a company from China, right? Which might also equally well be able to offer one of these technologies. Those are all, other considerations. So why Westinghouse is a harder question to answer, but some kind of nuclear companies are going to be part of these government handouts precisely because they want to pretend nuclear power is still part of the solution to climate change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think this is going to be the last question. This is a question about nuclear disarmament and war. Do you think that outright banning nuclear, even for military purposes, would reduce the severity and frequency of war, or would they become more commonplace since people are no longer scared of atomic bombs?
Can you say a question again? I just
Oh,
different.
yeah, sure. So would outright banning nuclear even for military purposes reduce the severity and frequency of war, in your opinion? Or would wars become more commonplace since people are no longer scared or threatened by bombs, atomic bombs?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
Okay? Because what you're getting at is the idea of nuclear deterrence. So that idea is sort of dates back to the 1940s and 50s, and the idea is, nuclear weapons are so destructive that countries would be scared of their use. They don't want to be used against their populations. And if two or more countries have nuclear weapons, then they will not go into war with each other because they're concerned about this. This is so-called mutually assured destruction, or MAD, right? And this idea has been what has allowed many countries to develop these very destructive weapons, and huge numbers of them, right? At the peak of the Cold War, there were over, I don't know, 70 or 80,000 weapons. I can't remember those numbers very well, but just absurdly large sets of numbers, on the basis that, oh, this is going to keep the United States and the Soviet Union from going to war, right? Now, there are two challenges there. If nuclear deterrence were really something that planners and government officials were to believe in, they would really not build so many weapons, right? Because ultimately, you just need a handful of weapons to be able to be dropped on another country. Why would you build these tens of thousands of weapons? So at the heart of nuclear deterrence, there is this little, what should you say, contradiction, right? If you believe in it, then you shouldn't be doing all of these things, but people claim to believe in it and yet do all of this, right? And the second is, if nuclear deterrence fails, then the destruction is going to be far worse than even if you just had regular conventional war, okay? So that is, I think, a contradiction. And it's also sort of an increase of danger. It's almost like, you are going, into a greater state of risk, so that the consequence of the risk doesn't happen, right? And you can never prove this, because ultimately nuclear deterrence is about the proof of a non-action, right, or non-eventuality, right? The analogy that somebody would once put it is, it's like a man standing in the middle of New York and waving his hands around like this. And the person next to somebody comes and says, "Why are you doing this?" He says, "Oh, I'm trying to keep away all the wild elephants." He said, "Wild elephants? We're in New York City. There are no wild elephants." And this guy says, "See, it works, right? If I do this, the wild elephants don't come here, right?" And that's, I think, part of the question. So was nuclear deterrence really the reason why the United States and the Soviet Union did not go to war, or were there other reasons? Just like while elephants typically don't come up to New York, maybe the Soviet Union and the United States may not have gone to war anyway. But the second thing to remember is that the Soviet Union and the United States did go to war against each other through proxies, right? In Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Angola, all these places, there was just massive numbers of people who died as a result of this so-called deterrence, right? And so anyway, your basic question is a deep one, and I think there's no easy answer to this. At some level, people believe in nuclear deterrence, and if they believe in nuclear deterrence, then maybe they're going to be less likely to go to war. But if they do go to war, the consequences are going to be far more severe, right? And the other thing to remember is that it's sort of like what I mentioned in the case of nuclear power and climate change. To deal with climate change, we have to think much larger about social and political changes that, change how we produce materials and live our lives. In a way, trying to get rid of nuclear weapons is also going to require far more fundamental changes to how countries behave in the world. And do they resort to war, or do you sort of kind of ban war outright? And also all of the material means to wage war that we are seeing on an everyday basis, right? We are seeing millions of people or thousands and thousands of people being slaughtered every day around the world by these weapons. And so it's not only nuclear weapons that are destructive, other weapons are also destructive, but nuclear weapons, if they are used, can make the destruction far worse, right? So it's a really difficult conundrum in a way, and requires us to sort of think big and think sort of more radically, trying to go to the root of the problems rather than some superficial, we'll just pass a law that does this or something of that sort. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. It is,
I think it helped. I think that was very good. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I all I can do under some circumstances to be honest and say, these are not things that one person can answer by themselves. This is something which we have to have much larger societal conversations about.
Hi, everyone. I just we're getting to the end of our session. I would just like to ask if anyone has any last words they want to say before we close it off. We have 2 minutes, or else we'll just end it here. Any last questions or comments? Okay. Well, I really like to I found this exceedingly interesting. Thank you to all the participants, MV Ramana, Kate Haché, Emma Fackenthall, and Erin Hurley. And I know Kate has a midterm now, so we do have to end on time. I will put the recording up and send this to everyone. And on behalf of the CEDAR project at St. Thomas University, I'd like to thank you all for your engagement. And just to remind you that we do have a webinar tonight. And if you go to the CEDAR site, you will see some of us, Emma and Ramana and I, will be on the webinar this evening. So thank you again to all, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.
Thank you very much, and good luck, Kate.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing, Susan, and thanks for writing such an interesting and helpful book, Ramana.
Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.